Hi, so my name is Maria, and I'm going to be discussing elements of myth and ritual in the three Indiana Jones movies, The Raiders of the Lost Ark, The Temple of Doom, and The Last Crusade. So, starting with The Raiders of the Lost Ark, the item that Indiana Jones is searching for is the Ark of the Covenant, which is a chest where supposedly the tablets that have the Ten Commandments on them are hidden. And the myth is the myth of the burning bush, which is where Moses encounters God, and God tells Moses what the Ten Commandments are. So Moses inscribes them on these tablets. And then the ritual that's connected to that myth is this. The tablets were central. The tablets and the Ark of the Covenant were central to different Jewish rituals. And the Ark of the Covenant was kept in the Temple of Solomon. So in terms of the myth ritualism theory, where myth and ritual are always tied together, this seems to kind of play a part in this movie with these 2 points where the myth kind of leads to the ritual. So if the ritual is involving the tablets and the Ark of the Covenant, the myth is explaining where they came from. So it's kind of the origin of the ritual, and it exists to support to kind of explain the existence of the ritual. In the Temple of Doom, I think is actually the best example of myth ritualism of the 3 movies, because the main myth is that Shiva, which was a god, one of the gods of Hinduism, gave 5 rocks to a Hindu priest, Sankara, and those 5 rocks were said to have magical properties. And in the village that Indiana Jones kind of stumbles upon, the rock is believed to keep the village safe. And the villagers say as soon as the rock was stolen by the Thuggee cult, the river in the village ran dry, all the crops and cattle died. So that is an example of Fraser's monomyth. The monomyth is that in almost every myth there's this kind of underlying basis or underlying story where it deals with a king, which represents a god, and he's tied to the vegetation. So vegetation having to do with fertility and a harvest and kind of a lifeblood. So in this case, I guess the rock kind of symbolizes the vegetation and the authority in this village, because as soon as the rock was taken away, the cattle, the crops, and everything that kept the village alive also was taken away and kind of just disappeared. And the theory is that when the rock comes back, that's like the rebirth of the king, and then the vegetation returns. So even within the same movie, when we're talking about the Thuggee cult, they had a similar myth wherein these 5 rocks all hold power, but the ritual had to do with human sacrifice, and they were worshipping the goddess Kali, and they were sacrificing humans in her name. So in that scenario, it's not exactly tied to vegetation, but they had these ideas about world domination and power, and so in that case, the ritual of human sacrifice kind of ties back to the rocks having this power and them giving up their sacrifices to Kali in order to have that power for themselves to later kind of take over the world. And then in The Last Crusade, the myth that Indiana Jones is dealing with is the myth of the Holy Grail. So there are different, as discussed in our lectures, different stories about it. And the one that they discuss in the movie is that 3 Templar knights during the First Crusade stumbled upon the Holy Grail, and 2 of them were left alive and emerged from the desert, and then they wrote directions on tablets. And then the kind of original myth is that Jesus poured his blood into the Holy Grail at the Last Supper. And then I guess the ritual that we could tie to that, which even persists to present day, is communism and the Eucharist in some Christian religions. So that's definitely tied to this idea of a king and a god kind of having a divine connection. The girl represents eternal life, and even in the movie, there's an instance where Indiana saves his father Henry by letting him drink from the Grail, so that represents that death and rebirth of Fraser's monomyth. And the father-son relationship that exists in the Last Crusade also can be tied to Harrison's theories about Zeus and his father Kronos, and kind of their very difficult family and father-son relationship. And that father-son relationship has also been tied to kind of a worship of God within Christianity. So there are several, as we can see within all three movies, the theories about myths, Fraser's monomyth theory, the theories of how myths and ritual are connected are visible and are kind of apparent in different aspects of the movies. It's not always a direct connection, but we can see that in a lot of these cultures that Indiana Jones is dealing with and is immersed in, myths and rituals definitely have a huge role in the way that the people that he interacts with go about their lives, and the way that sometimes they have stories which explain their rituals, and sometimes their rituals kind of originate from the story, and the reason they carry out these rituals is because of the myth. So as we can see, there's a lot of possible discussion of how one impacts the other and vice versa, but it's really interesting to see how these like action adventure movies have a very real how myth ritualism has a very real importance in these action adventure movies that you wouldn't necessarily imagine that they would.